Jay Leno had survived 22 years of live television, a brutal comedy circuit, and the kind of Hollywood politics that swallowed lesser men whole. None of that prepared him for the afternoon. A cracked fuel line nearly took everything: his hands, his face, and the collection he had spent 4 decades building inside a Burbank garage. November 12th, 2022 didn't arrive with warning signs or a slow build. 30 seconds was all it took. A hiss, a flash, and one of America's most recognizable entertainers was on fire. Most people start this story at the explosion. The real story starts long before the flames ever found him. What Leno built inside that Burbank complex wasn't a hobby space or a vanity project. It was a mechanical archive that he treated with the seriousness of a curator and the obsession of someone who genuinely could not stop. While other late-night hosts accumulated vacation properties and financial portfolios, Leno accumulated machines. Over 180 cars and 160 motorcycles filled those bays, and none of them sat as static displays. Every vehicle ran. Every engine turned over. The 1907 white steam car sat alongside a 1963 jet turbine prototype and a steam-powered motorcycle from an era when engineers were still arguing about what an internal combustion engine could even become, and Leno drove all of them regularly because preservation without use was a concept he found genuinely offensive. His crew described the garage as something closer to a living organism than a building. The smells shifted depending on what was running that day. Motor oil some mornings, aged leather others, the sharp chemical bite of gasoline when something old and temperamental was being coaxed back into operation. Leno moved through those bays the way a conductor navigates an orchestra mid-performance, knowing every instrument, every tendency, every place where things could go wrong. Decades of that familiarity had given him something valuable. What it couldn't give him was immunity from a fault too small to see. Dave Kikiki had worked alongside Leno long enough to read the room without needing words, and that Saturday afternoon in November carried no obvious tension. The two of them were running what the security logs would later describe as a routine maintenance check on the 1907 white steam car: clean the fuel line, light the pilot, run the steam system through a basic pressure test. Laughter is audible in the background of that security footage, the easy laughter of men comfortable in their work and completely unaware of what the next 30 seconds would produce. The hairline crack in the fuel line had likely been forming for some time before that afternoon, waiting in the way that small mechanical failures wait, quietly and without announcement, until conditions are exactly right. When the gasoline vapor finally reached the pilot flame, the result wasn't a smolder. The flash triggered motion sensors across the entire compound, and Leno registered it first as sound rather than pain, the world, as he described it later, inhaling and exhaling fire simultaneously. Then the heat arrived, tearing through his shirt and climbing his chest and face before Dave could close the distance between them. What Dave did next required bare hands and a shop rag and cost him blistered arms from wrist to elbow. Leno later made jokes about that heroism in interviews. Dave never brought it up unprompted. By the time open air reached him, portions of his clothing had fused to his skin, and he was conscious, which was both a medical advantage and a private torment that no one in that parking lot could fully appreciate. Paramedics arriving at the scene found him sitting upright on the pavement, face blackened, hands trembling, already issuing quiet directions to the people around him. "Don't let the cars burn." That was his first coherent sentence after the explosion, not a request for pain relief and not a cry for help, just a directive about the machines still inside. One firefighter on that call said later that those 4 words told him everything about the man on the pavement. Inside the garage, the situation had developed its own momentum. Firefighters pushing through the side entrance found themselves in a collector's worst-case scenario. Every bay held potential accelerant, original rubber seals, and century-old hydraulic systems and tanks designed long before modern fire suppression existed as a concept. A crew member near the entrance called out a warning about pressurized tanks still full of fuel, and the temperature throughout the structure had already climbed past 400 degrees. Molten metal dripped from overhead racks. Tires burst from the heat in sequence, each one a percussion note in the general chaos. The men working to contain it understood that one wrong decision, the wrong hose angle on the wrong surface, could convert a serious fire into something that ended careers and lives simultaneously. They moved with the careful precision of people who knew exactly what was at stake. The fire held. Every unit dispatched to North Hollywood Way spent the better part of an hour working the perimeter and interior bays, and what ultimately slowed the spread wasn't luck, but the ventilation system Leno had installed years earlier, not for safety compliance, not because an inspector required it, but because he wanted clean air while he worked. That system, designed for comfort rather than emergency response, turned out to be one of the primary reasons the entire structure didn't come down. The Grossman Burn Center in Los Angeles handles trauma that most hospital systems never encounter, and the assessment on Leno's arrival was direct and grim. Third-degree burns covering nearly 7% of his body, concentrated across his face, chest, and both hands. Surgeons prepared for skin grafts using donor tissue harvested from other areas of his body. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy was scheduled to accelerate healing and reduce scarring. The next 24 hours, doctors told Mavis Leno, would determine the scope of permanent damage, and Mavis didn't leave. Hospital staff noted that detail quietly in the weeks that followed, the way you note something that speaks for itself. While fans gathered on the sidewalk outside leaving letters and model cars, while fellow comedians sent messages through publicists, Mavis sat in a hospital room without press attention and waited. Leno was polite to every nurse and thanked every surgeon by name, and somewhere during a wound dressing asked one of the attending staff what they drove. One nurse admitted later that she forgot for a moment she was treating a burn patient. The humor wasn't performed for anyone's benefit. It was genuinely how he processed pressure, through warmth and connection and lightness, the way some people can only access those qualities when everything external has been removed. 2 major surgeries followed. Hyperbaric sessions that would have exhausted a man 20 years younger became part of his daily routine. 10 days after admission, doctors cleared him to leave, a recovery timeline that surprised the surgical team given the initial prognosis. His lead surgeon put it plainly: a few more seconds of direct exposure, and the conversation about recovery would have looked entirely different. Fire investigators combed through the wreckage and reached their conclusion within weeks. The source was unambiguous: the hairline crack in the 1907 White steam car's fuel line, which had released gasoline vapor into the surrounding air until the pilot flame located it. The incident classification came back as an industrial accident, non-criminal, with no regulatory violation attached to it. What the report implied, without stating directly, was something more uncomfortable than negligence. Several of Leno's antique vehicles, though immaculate in their aesthetic preservation, still operated on original materials, seals, lines, and fittings predating synthetic manufacturing by decades, authentic in every way, fragile in ways their polished surfaces never revealed. Leno received those findings in private, and his response carried none of the defensiveness that the situation might have excused. 2 words: that's on me. For someone who had spent decades publicly celebrating the danger and unpredictability of old machines, that admission landed differently than a press statement. The fire hadn't been some external failure or unforeseeable catastrophe. It was a conversation the machines had been trying to have with him for years, and on that Saturday in November, he finally got the message in the most direct way available. 6 weeks after the explosion, bandages still covering portions of his hands, Leno stood on stage doing stand-up. The audience that night saw a man with visible scarring on his face and arms delivering punchlines about his own near death with the timing of someone who had been performing for 50 years, and when reporters pressed him on the decision to return to the stage so quickly, his answer carried the plain logic of someone who had long since stopped distinguishing between his work and his life. Getting burned doing what you love felt like an acceptable exchange. Quitting felt like a slower injury, the kind that healed poorly and left deeper marks than any fire could produce. Back at the garage before his doctors would have recommended it, Leno rolled up his sleeves and got back under a hood within days of returning home. Every aging fuel fitting in the collection came out personally, replaced not because someone assigned the task, but because he needed to understand each one, its history, its condition, its specific failure point. The process accomplished something no formal rehabilitation program could have replicated, because the garage that had nearly killed him became the place where he rebuilt both the machines and himself at the same time. His crew started calling him the Iron Man of Burbank, which he dismissed with a wave of his scarred hand every time he heard it. The full restoration of the facility ran for months, and Leno oversaw every element of it with the same attention he brought to a complete engine rebuild. Automatic fuel shutoff systems went into every bay. Industrial CO2 suppression was integrated into the sealing infrastructure throughout the structure. Gas sensors capable of detecting vapor concentrations well below the explosive threshold were mounted at intervals across all working areas. Extinguishers were positioned not for code compliance but for practical reach, placed where someone actually standing at a workbench could access one in under 3 seconds. None of this was a regulatory response. It was the redesign of a space by someone who had learned its failure mode personally and had no interest in a second lesson. When the doors reopened in mid-2023, Leno didn't arrive in a modern vehicle selected for safety and symbolic comfort. Behind the wheel of a 1911 Stanley steamer, grinning through the windshield with scarred hands on the steering wheel, he pulled back into the space where the explosion had happened. And the crowd that watched understood the choice immediately. A steam-powered machine, driven by the man who had nearly died inside one, back through the doors that had nearly been his last exit. The answer to the question the fire had asked him came through the windshield of a 111-year-old automobile moving under its own pressure, which was the only kind of answer he had ever been interested in giving. What the first responders found inside that garage on November 12th wasn't the aftermath of a reckless man's negligence. It was the interior life of someone who had built an entire existence around the belief that old machines deserved to keep running. Half-finished sketches on the workbench, a burned journal page still bearing handwritten notes for his next episode of Jay Leno's Garage. A coffee cup, untouched and still warm at the moment of the explosion, sitting on a workbench beside tools that predated both of them. None of that was the evidence of a hobby. All of it was the evidence of a man living entirely inside his purpose, where the line between work and life had dissolved so completely that even an explosion couldn't locate it. The scars on his face and hands will remain visible for the rest of his life, and they function less as warnings than as records. Every raised line of healed skin is a timestamp. The moment the machines pushed back, and the moment he chose, without prolonged deliberation, to return anyway. Passion is supposed to carry risk, he has said in various forms since the fire, and the absence of risk is the absence of meaning. And a man who stops touching the things he loves in order to stay comfortable has already lost something that doesn't grow back the way skin does. The fire on North Hollywood Way burned for less than an hour. The story it produced has not gone quiet. Jay Leno, automotive collector, comedian, former Tonight Show host, and owner of one of the most celebrated private garages in American history, lost skin and comfort and the illusion that his workspace was a controlled environment where the past could be preserved without consequence. What the fire never reached, what no temperature could touch regardless of how high it climbed, Was the quality that put him back behind the wheel of a steam car on the day those rebuilt doors reopened. Some people are defined by what they survive. Leno is defined by what he drives back into. And somewhere in Burbank right now, inside a garage full of restored classics, jet turbines, and century-old steam engines, there is an engine running that needed his attention, and he is already there.